Hey there, everybody. Welcome. We're going to be talking about species, counterpoint, today, in a little video that I have creatively named Introduction to Species, Counterpoint. Well, let's get right to it. A lot of people complain in their lives that they never had an introduction to species counterpoint, and unfortunately, you will not be able to do that after tonight or this morning, whenever you happen to be watching this. So, let's get into it. What is species counterpoint? First question is, what's counterpoint? So in the previous video, which I know you watched, I hope you enjoyed it, The Ancient Art of Organum, what we did was examine early trends in adding a second voice to a pre-existing melody in the later medieval era, around 850 to 1300. And this was called organum. This early counterpoint was called organum. This pre-existing voice was called the voice, or the vox principalis, which is the principal voice, and the newly added voice was called the vox originalis, or organal voice. So sometimes the pre-existing melody served as the upper voice, and then you added a lower organal voice, or sometimes the pre-existing melody was in the lower voice, and you added an upper organal voice, or an upper contrapuntal voice. Common techniques and textures that we saw in early counterpoint or organum were parallel organum, that was doubling the melody at the fourth or fifth below above. So that's our melody. We could double it at the fifth above. Something like that. The drone method, which would be to add a constant drone below the melody, or the melodic segment. I'll just go ahead and put the tonic down there in the drone. A next development was called free organum, which would have been note against note, one note in the counterpoint for every one in the melody. That's like with parallel, but it's not like with the drone. And it featured contrary motion, so that is different from parallel, and it's different from the drone. The drone is similar, contrary, oblique. The drone is oblique motion. But within free counterpoint, it featured contrary motion, but you could also have parallel, oblique, or similar motion. And maybe an example of that is what we'll be working on today. We're basically working on free organum. For species, I think you could call it pretty much free organum. It's a little bit anachronistic, but that's fine. And then finally, melismatic organum, which would be many to one, with several notes in the newly added organal voice for each long-held note of the pre-existing melody. So I'll go ahead and do a free organum version and a melismatic organum version. So that's going to be my counterpoint voice, my Cantus Firmus. And for each of those notes, I'm going to put one note in the counterpoint. So that's an example of free organum. It's also an example of what we're going to be doing today, which is one-to-one counterpoint, species, counterpoint, specifically first species counterpoint. A melismatic version might sound like this. So for each of these notes, I'm going to do a bunch of decorations in the upper voice. But just very slowly. So that was melismatic. And then there's a rhythmicized version, which I guess we could just do a little bit of. Something like that. Probably not on the synthesizer sound, but it's fairly authentic for early counterpoint, otherwise known as organum. So we're still talking about intro to species counterpoint, what counterpoint is, not yet talking about species. At this period, so everything we looked at in the last video was up to about 1200 AD, and now we're in the 1300s, so the 14th century. So there's some new trends going on. The term counterpoint is first developed in this century. So they were just calling it organum at first. Remember, organum's kind of derived from the word for instrument. So counterpoint is a new term in the 14th century, and its name emphasizes the now trendy new obsession with keeping the two voices distinct from one another. The drone method it did keep the voices separate, but the one of the voices is too simplistic. It's not really doing anything, it's just droning. So it doesn't really sound like a separate melody, which is something that counterpoint does try to achieve. And then simply harmonizing a melody with itself in parallel fourths or parallel fifths was distasteful. I wrote that it was distasteful. It is kind of true that that's what theorists said, but basically that idea of parallel fourths and parallel fifths started to fall out of fashion, and it hasn't come back in fashion since then, except maybe you could say with like rock music. And then contrary motion was now favored, right, compared to parallel, compared to oblique, and similar is not frequent enough for it to be a big deal. So contrary motion is something new. Contrary motion is now the favored way of composing, since it clearly established the independence of the voices, and that's going to be a big theme here. Imperfect consonances were permitted in addition to perfect consonances, and even dissonances were allowed on occasion. We're not going to talk about any dissonances today. If I talk about any dissonances, you're allowed to, well, anyway, I'll stop not talking about dissonances. Otherwise, my threat might have come true. Okay, and then parallel octaves, fifths, and unisons are now not allowed. In the last video, man, we saw all kinds of cases of parallel fifths, parallel unisons. I don't know if we saw parallel octaves, but it wouldn't have been surprising if we had. Oh, we did in parallel organum a bit. So, but now those things are not allowed. So this is the new 14th century trend. Since they diminish the independence of the voices from one another, they make them sound temporarily as if they're blended into one. So when I do this, I'm just doing parallel fifths on the keyboard, and it really just does sound like one voice that has a big fancy fifth above it. Whereas if I start doing them in some contrary motion in there, contrary motion, one oblique motion, one little mess up, then it really does start to sound like two different voices. So that's what they are aiming for aesthetically in this time period. Some theorists would recommend alternating between perfect and imperfect intervals when possible. Just keep that in the back of your head for now. It'll come up a little bit. It's more like an aesthetic recommendation. It's not a rule. Parallel perfect consonances were outlawed. As I said, perfect fifths, perfect octaves, perfect unisons. But you could definitely have parallel imperfect consonances. Those sound great. Thirds. Here's parallel sixths. So that's perfectly acceptable. Note that the perfect fourth is now treated as a dissonance, and from this point on, still treated as a dissonance today, except, you know, in like popular and rock music, like in alternative styles of rock and pop and folk and stuff like that, you do find perfect fourths treated not as dissonances. But even if you look at, you know, like modern Disney music, it's still treating the perfect fourth as if it's a dissonance, not a consonance. And we'll have a whole screen on that because I think it's kind of cool. Cadential patterns that were the last two notes of the phrase began to be formalized, and that's a big thing for us to learn in this unit. They featured contrary motion to either the unison or the octave. We saw in the last unit that the ends of phrases tended to end on unisons or octaves. The beginnings of phrases were often on unisons and octaves, or they were on fifths. But that's really important to think about. We're going to pay a lot of attention to beginnings and ends of phrases today as well. Okay, and here's a little picture of music from Marchetto of Padua. I think that's in Italy somewhere, and 1318, so early 14th century. Marchetto in his treatise had one example of, I think, what we could call a cadence, D and F, Two different voices converging onto a unison. So in that case, you have the upper voice goes down and the lower voice goes up, and so a third converges on the unison at the cadence. Or a sixth, D up to B, converges to, or diverges to an octave. The minor third converges on the unison, and the major sixth converges to the octave. It doesn't really work with minor sixths or major thirds, interestingly enough. And in this case, in both of these examples, there's always one voice that's moving by a semitone, F going down to E, B going up to C. This is a Phrygian cadence. We're not really going to be talking about all that much today, but you could do exactly this. We're going to see this thing just inverted. So imagine the lower voice is B going to C, and the upper voice is D going to C. So B going to C, and D going to C. Then you would have a tenth going to an octave, or we can condense it. So I'm doing exactly this 3-1 thing at the bottom there, just onto C. D, C, and B, C. A third going to a unison, and there's a semitone from B up to C. You have to imagine this is in soprano clef, but those are going to be our two cadences. Okay, and just a little proof that this really is a 14th century trend. Marchetto of Padua, he was like hip before other people were. Okay, so 14th century. You guys are going to be very cool in the sort of like Ars Nova era if you make it through this unit. So now, what in particular is the species aspect of counterpoint? Species approach to counterpoint. What does this mean? As the Renaissance takes off, so in around 1400, like a little bit after where we are, but we're looking at, anyway, the stuff we're doing today is Renaissance style, you can say. As the Renaissance takes off, theorists begin developing pedagogical approaches to teaching counterpoint. So, like, they're not just doing it for their own purposes as composers, but they're trying to figure out how to teach students, just like I'm trying to figure out how to teach you guys. Counterpoint is the foundation of musical structure in the Renaissance. The concept of a chord doesn't really exist in the Renaissance. That's hard for us to conceive, but it's true. Composers were not thinking about chords. Composers are predominantly writing for singers, and the composers themselves are predominantly singers, and so they're thinking like singers. Composers aren't even writing in score the way we do, like, all the parts on one page, but they'll write each part separately, meaning the composer will write out the tenor voice, right, which is like, that's the Cantus Firmus, and then take a separate piece of paper and write out an upper voice to go with it, and then take a separate piece of paper and write out the bass voice and stuff like that. I mean, that's the way composers were still thinking. If you ever want to learn more about that, especially if you're a composer or a historian, talk to me. I will tell you about this very cool book called How Composers Work by Jessie Ann Owens. And then, so what they were doing is they were thinking horizontally much more than they were thinking vertically. We'll define those terms a little bit later, but horizontally is melodic and vertically is harmonic. So, nevertheless, the species approach is the approach used consistently since Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. And this approach has 5 different species. The first species is what we're doing today. 1 against 1. 1:1 means 1 against 1 or note against note counterpoint. And it uses only consonant vertical intervals. Second species, 2 against 1. 2 notes in the counterpoint for every 1 in the Cantus Firmus. And you get to use one specific type of dissonance in that one called the passing tone. In third species, it's 4 against 1. Sometimes it's just 3 against 1, but that just means 4 notes in the counterpoint for every 3 in the Cantus Firmus. That's a little bit more like the melismatic stuff that we were looking at. Fourth species is again 2-1, but specifically incorporates suspensions. So there's a little bit of rhythmic interest, but you're still just using half notes and whole notes. And then finally, in fifth species, you get to combine all of the above, and you get to incorporate some new rhythmic variation. And I think we are going to be going through all 5 species over the course of this year. Cantus Firmus, firm chant or held chant. The Cantus Firmus is the pre-existing melodic voice on which a counterpoint is built. Cantus Firmus means established melody, or firm melody. The CF, Cantus Firmus, CF, was traditionally sung by the tenor. Now, why am I telling you that? Because it's cool. Because the word tenor means hold, like tenere, tenere, I don't know, in Italian is to hold. So the tenor is the one who's holding the foundational voice, and that foundational voice is the pre-existing melody. Now, I know you're thinking, why is the bass not the foundational voice? It isn't until the later 16th century, so the end of the Renaissance, that the bass voice begins to be thought of as more foundational than the tenor voice. It's true, it's just the way it was. This is right around the same time, and not coincidentally, the concepts of root and chord and inversion emerge. So that happens at the very beginning of the Baroque era in 1600s. Early 1600s, you get the idea of chords and roots and inversions, and just before that, like half a century before that, composers start thinking like, oh, maybe the bass is the main voice you should pay attention to as opposed to the tenor. So usually the CF, the Cantus Firmus, is given ahead of time like the layout of black and white squares in a crossword puzzle. But it's a good exercise to try your hand at composing a Cantus Firmus yourself. So that is what we are going to do a little bit of, and you will read that in the chapter by Salzer and Schachter. Here's some factors that we're going to consider, and we'll look at these in more detail in the next screen. Number of notes. How many notes do you want to have in your Cantus Firmus that you're composing? What mode or scale is it going to be? We're really just doing major and minor. In minor, it's going to be mostly natural minor, except at the very end. But you really could do Dorian or Phrygian, and then the other ones, the only other two that you would do are Lydian and Mixed Lydian, and we won't be worrying about that too much. So you're going to pay special attention to the beginning and the end of the little melody, as I mentioned. And you want to make sure you have variety in your melody, and you want to make sure you have a single climax, and that really helps you just get like a nice arched contour. And finally, you want to pay attention to the horizontal intervals, meaning the melodic intervals. Later in this discussion, we will get to vertical intervals between voices, but right now we're talking about just a single voice. So here are some factors to consider when composing your own Cantus Firmus. As I said on the previous screen, we are considering the number and the value of the notes. So in terms of number, we're just going to, this just comes right out of the book, the chapter that you read by Salzer and Schachter, between 8 and 16 notes in the Cantus Firmus. And then we're going to have them be all of the same duration. So we're just using whole notes. That means you're just not thinking about rhythmic values at all, and there's no notes that are more accented than any other ones. Okay, the point is you're just thinking of notes as equal things. You're trying to design a melody with just note succession, not anything else like a rhythm or motive or harmony, anything like that. That's what makes it an interesting exercise. Okay, in terms of mode or scale, as I said on the previous page, we're just going to be using major or natural minor. Occasionally you might see in the chapter Dorian or Phrygian. I think it's cool to try those ones. The Phrygian is interesting too because its cadences are different and it's not something we're super used to. So I do recommend, paying attention to those in the chapter. But now just major and natural minor. In minor, this is pretty important. You're not going to raise the leading tone. In the Cantus Firmus, you're not going to raise the leading tone at all. When you get into counterpoint in first species at the end of this presentation, you are going to raise the leading tone, but only in the second to last measure, only at the end. So basically, if you're in a minor key, all of the notes are in natural minor throughout the entire exercise, except at the very end of the exercise in the second to last measure, and maybe the third to last measure, you might raise scale degree 6. Okay, cool. Eventually, as I write here, you will do so. You'll raise the leading tone at the cadence, but in the contrapuntal voice, not the Cantus Firmus. Beginning and the end of your Cantus Firmus melody. You're going to begin the Cantus Firmus on the tonic, scale degree 1. You're going to end the Cantus Firmus by descending stepwise to the tonic, usually going 3-2-1. If you were in major, it would be mi, re, do. If you were in minor, it would be do, ti, la. Otherwise, if it's not 3-2-1, then it's just 2-1. So re, do, or ti, la. The range. I wrote here, don't extend beyond a tenth. Oh yeah, don't extend beyond a tenth within the Cantus Firmus. That is still a good principle. I had a little note to myself that I'd ask you if you remember what the range of the Star Spangled Banner is. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you it's an octave plus a fifth. So, and that's considered a very large range. So an octave plus a third, which is what a tenth is, that's a pretty sizable range. And maybe like the biggest you'd ever want to go is an octave plus a fifth. But most normal people can't sing the Star Spangled Banner. I know this because I've heard people sing it. I had to be a judge at a contest once. It's hilarious. Large scale contour. The Cantus Firmus should rise to a single high point, a climax, and then it should return to the tonic. Or it could do the reverse. It could start on a higher tonic, descend to a kind of low climax, which is called a nadir, and then return back upward to the tonic. But that's very rare. Most melodies begin low, crescendo, rise in the middle to a high point, and then come back again. Occasionally, Cantus Firmus will begin on the low tonic and then end on the high tonic, so it'll climb an octave over the course of the whole phrase. Or it might start on the high tonic and then end on the low tonic. So an example would be Joy to the World, that Handel melody. Right, that one. If you end it there, it starts at the top and ends at the bottom. But if it actually does go back to the top. Yeah, anyway. Okay. And the climax pitch should not be the leading tone. And that's just like, I'm just going to make up a little melody here. This guy, that you don't want that as the top pitch that doesn't ever resolve, and it's just because the leading tone, as we're going to learn, has strong tendencies to want to resolve. And so if it's the climax pitch, it, by definition, doesn't get to resolve because it's the highest pitch. So you don't want that to be your climax. It could be a nadir. Variety. Avoid repeating the climax pitch. Even after interpolating other notes, you'll see an example of that. So it's okay if that's confusing for now. Avoid immediately repeating the same note. You don't want your Cantus Firmus melody to just be... Right. Avoid repeating melodic patterns, even if transposed. You don't really want to go... because you're just taking a pattern and repeating it. So in actual music that we listen to and compose and classical music, right, it's super common to take patterns and repeat them and transpose them and sequence them. It just so happens that in Cantus Firmus, I mean, in Counterpoint generally, we're trying not to develop patterns. That's just like part of the game. Okay, steps, skips, and leaps. Steps, otherwise known as conjunct motion. Conjunct just means like kind of near itself, I guess, or adjacent. Steps should be more common than skips and leaps. And skips and leaps are both considered disjunct. Disjunction is a typo, it should be just disjunct. Skips should be more common than leaps. So the smaller the interval, the more common it is. Steps are the most common. Skips are just little tiny leaps of a third, and then leaps are anything bigger, a fourth or bigger. So steps are common, skips, medium, and leaps, least common. But you should probably have at least one leap in, any given melody, whether it's the Cantus Firmus or the Counterpoint. Skip is a third, while leap is anything greater than a third. In first species, don't leap more than a fifth. Later, you'll be able to leap as much as an octave, just like in... This is a sixth. That's a sixth. In first species, don't leap any more than a fifth. Okay, the law of recovery. Counter your leaps by stepwise motion in the opposite direction. Again, we'll see examples of this, but if my leap is, let's say, an octave in Somewhere Over the Rainbow, you're jumping from low to high and then stepping back in the opposite direction. That's the law of recovery. If you leap in one direction, counter it on the next interval by step in the opposite direction. Avoid multiple skips or leaps in a row. We'll see an example of that. The following are the horizontal intervals, the melodic intervals that are allowed in Cantus Firmus. Seconds are going to be allowed, both major and minor. Thirds are allowed, both major and minor. Fourths, only perfect fourths, no augmented fourths. Fifths also, but only perfect fifths, no diminished fifths. And remember, we're not leaping any more than a fifth. So those are all the intervals that we are allowed for our Cantus Firmus. We are going to make sure to avoid dissonant leaps, and these would be the tritones. So we're not going to leap any augmented fourths. We're not going to leap any diminished fifths. And then ultimately, and you might actually need this toward the end of the presentation when we're talking about first species counterpoint. Yeah, you do. Ultimately, you'll need to avoid the augmented second, which is abbreviated A2, in harmonic minor. So you're at the cadence. If the second to last note you raise the leading tone, then in the third to last note, the note right before the leading tone, if you're on scale degree 6, you have to raise scale degree 6. We will see a brief example of that. But that's an important concept that you do want to start paying attention to. If I were to say just avoid augmented seconds, you could easily focus where you're paying attention to, because there's only one place in any of the scales that we have where you will find an augmented second, and that is between scale degrees 6 and 7 in harmonic minor. So if we were in A minor, A, B, C, D, E, F, G sharp, A. Between lowered 6th and raised 7, that's your augmented second. So you don't use that melodically. If you want those notes, you'd have to go 6, 5, 7, 1, something like that. Just a little note about tritones. Note that all scales have at least one augmented fourth or diminished fifth. In major scales, this is always going to be between scale degrees 4 and 7. So I'm going to do C major, scale degree 4, scale degree 7, and there, that's an augmented fourth. Or if I did scale degree 7 up to scale degree 4, it's a diminished fifth. If you are in a minor scale, there's two places you could find one between scale degrees 2 and 6, when we're talking about either natural minor or harmonic minor. So I'm going to do this in A minor, and scale degree 2, and F, 6. So those are exactly the same notes as I was doing when I was in C major. Anyway, between scale degrees 2 and 6 in natural minor or in harmonic minor, and then between scale degrees 4 and raise 7 also, if you do raise leading tone between D and G sharp in harmonic minor or melodic minor. And by the way, either of those, anytime you have an augmented fourth, you can flip it and it becomes a diminished fifth. So that last one, G up to G sharp, that's an augmented fourth. But if I go G sharp up to D, it's a diminished fifth. So let's look at some examples and some critiques of those examples. Start with this one. Do or C. Okay, with alto clef, I'm going to have you sing note names. With the other clefs, you can sing solfege. But so we'll do this on C. Ready to sing with me? These are our whole notes. C. Ready? C, D, C, B, C, D, C. Very quick question was, which C is this? Is it middle C? Is it below middle C? Is it above middle C? The way to remember is alto clef is always centered right on middle C. So this is middle C, the D above middle C, the B below, right? This is the D right below treble clef, which is up here. This is the B right above bass clef, which is down here. So otherwise known as, this is C4, D4, C4, B3, C4, etc. So let's say this was a melody and we want to critique it. Too repetitive. It's too focused around the note C, not C4. How about this one? Let's sing it with me. C, C. I'll do it up here. Ready? Ready? And C, D, F, E, D, F, E, F, E, D, C. Again. C, D, F, E, D, F, E, F, E, D, C. previous one, but it's not quite great yet. It doesn't have a climax. Its highest note is F, but F is repeated a couple times throughout the excerpt. It's not a single climax. It is, so basically you would say it doesn't have a climax, or it repeats its climax note. That's the problem. Here they fix it. They give us almost the same melody, but now it's better. So it's a C again, ready, and C, D, F, E, A, G, F, D, E, D, C. Do it again. C, D, F, E, A, G, F, D, E, D, C. Okay, I'm just going to point out some things about reading alto clef, right? Like I said, middle C. This E is the E at the bottom of the treble clef, right? The lowest line of treble clef. This G up here is the line that's circled on, that the G clef circles. Do definitely encourage you to think of it that way. And so this one, what's going to be wrong with this one? I think it sounds fine. Good job, melody, for being good. So that is an example of why this is really a pretty cool little thing to study. I mean, it's definitely like a crossword puzzle. It's not like we're not composing. We're learning how to compose music, definitely. But this is something I often think to myself that this is something that Paul McCartney did naturally and John Lennon didn't necessarily do very naturally. John Lennon's melodies tend to be a lot more like this one, all focused around the same note, and Paul McCartney's melodies do much more the expansive melodic thing. And I use that as an example because they're both, at least, they're equally good. They're equally profound geniuses. So it's possible to do stuff either way. But I do think there's something to be said for working on melodic variation like this. Okay, let's look at some more examples. Actually, on keyboard it sounds fine. But okay, I'll just go ahead and try to sing it. And I'll do this on solfege because it's in treble clef. Do it with me. Yeah, I'll just give 4 snaps for do, la, mi, ti, sol, mi, do, la, ti, sol, re, do. So it's fine. Those notes work. It's just not a melody. Why? Too disjunct. There's too many leaps and skips. And the failure to obey the law of recovery, which we will review again on a later screen. But remember, it's just like if you're going to leap up a big thing here, they're leaping a 6th, they should counter it by a step in the opposite direction. Okay, how about this next melody? Yeah, we'll do 2 snaps. Ready? And A, B, C, D, E, F, E, C, D, C, B, A. What's wrong with that one? It's too conjunct. There's just too few skips and leaps. In fact, there's no skips and no leaps. It's all stepwise, entirely predictable. So this one is too random. Top one is too random. Bottom one is too predictable. Okay, let's try this melody. I gotta put it high in my range because look, there's gonna be a big leap. F, G, A, G, F, E, C, D, E, F. Okay, there's lots of conjunct stuff. There's obviously these 2 very big leaps, but the big important thing is that neither of those leaps obeys the law of recovery. That guy, a leap downward, should be countered in the opposite direction by a step right afterward. So you can leap down. Here they're leaping down an octave. I said don't leap more than a fifth, but like eventually you'll be able to leap an octave. You want to counter it in the opposite direction. They didn't do that. Here there's a leap up of a sixth, and it should be countered in the opposite direction, but it is not. It should go down. So here they have fixed it, and the law of recovery, I have that written out at the top. After a leap, reverse direction by taking a step in the opposite direction. So let's see if we can sing this one. That's very high, but anyway, I apologize for it being so high in my range to you, I guess. Ready? And F, G, A, B flat, D, C, G, F, E, F. All right. That works. It's actually much easier to sing. There is still a leap down by an octave, and now they have followed the law of recovery. They've actually gone up. Here, they had to fix some notes because they changed what's going on in here. So, but there's still a leap in the same place. Now it's a leap up of a fifth from C up to G. It should go down in the opposite direction, and it does. It goes from G down to F. So both times do they obey the law of recovery. And we're going to show you one more cool thing about this. So we have on the left a melody that violates stuff. Sing. So I'll call this do, re, mi, fa, mi, do, re. Okay. Oh, and there is a flat there in that time. We'll do it with so. Okay, do it with me. Ready? And so, la, ti. First one. Do, ti, so, la. Okay, so we're just pretending there's a flat in there. And then letter B, a similar thing, but a little bit different. Ready? Starting on do. And do, ti, la, sol, so, fa, re, mi. Okay, in both these cases, there's a leap up of an octave and then a move down by step. So they are both obeying the law of recovery, but one is much easier to sing than the other. The first one's difficult to sing and sounds just weird. It sounds like two different melodies, right? Like a low voice and then a completely different voice going. And it's almost like at the beginning, the main note is C. And then, so it's almost like there's a leap of an 11th there. I mean, because the C is the accented thing. So anyway, the way they fix it is, so you can still leap up an octave as long as you just want to ideally move down into it and then leap up an octave and then move down. So arrows here, you can see that this is an example of where they do it, right? This melody goes up to there. It's moving up, and then it goes down, and then it goes up again there. And then on the C, it goes up to G. And so it goes down from D to C. And then it goes down. So the law of recovery is even better if you don't just counter it in the opposite direction, but you move into it from the opposite direction. And so this one is just weird. But this one is quite nice. And it sounds all like one melody. Okay, so that's some subtle stuff, but hopefully you'll carry that with you your whole life when you're listening to the Beatles, for instance. So just 3 quick little arch forms. The inverted arch shape. What I mentioned before is that with most of your melodies, with your Cantus Firmus, when you're practicing these specific types of melodies, you're going to begin on the tonic, always. You want to alternate between leaps up and steps down. This is just guidance. You could do the opposite. You could leap down and step up, but then you're going to have, we want the arch shape, not the inverted arch. So ignore the word inverted. It would be inverted if you leapt down and walked back up, but the normal arch is you're leaping up and then walking back down, and then you're going to return, usually going 3, 2, 1, and landing on the tonic. So all three of these melodies do that, and then I will point out to you that Twinkle Twinkle and the ABCs do that as well. But let's play these. So we'll call this La on G. Oh no, sorry, we're calling it G. And G, D, C, B flat, A, G, B flat, A, G. Okay, and do the next one with me. We're starting on G again, but note that we we don't go all the way up to D, we go to just C. G, ready? And G, C, B flat, A, G, F, B flat, A, G. And I want to point out that this G is the G that's at the top of the bass clef, right? And this is middle C, so that's helping you orient. And we're going to start again on G. All these melodies are just considered good. They all do the same thing. They jump up, they walk down, and they counter it with the leap in one direction and back on tonic. So it's 3 different versions. They're almost exactly the same, but this is just showing you that you can get variety, even by following the same general principle. Ready for G? G, ready, and G, D, C, B flat, A, G, F, B flat, A, G. Okay. So let's do some critique on these melodies. I'll just go ahead and play them. Okay. So that's something there's just one little thing that's weird about it. They have it bracketed. And the issue is that thing that's bracketed is outlining the augmented fourth. So it's not like the melody leaps from the F to the B, which is the augmented fourth, but because it does a contour down to the F, and then the contour also accentuates the B by going back down again. There's a little bit too much emphasis on that F to B. So you want to avoid outlining augmented fourth. And then check out this one. This one, I say, is actually fine. You might not see this in some counterpoint treatises. They might tell you not to do this. The authors say that you shouldn't do this, but it's bad to outline the augmented fourth, the way you have an A. It's actually less bad to outline that diminished fifth. So give it a listen again. Not too terribly bad. Okay, letter C. Let's see what's going on. I'm going to do it again because I messed up. I'll do an octave below. So what do you think might be the issue there? We've outlined a seventh. We can see that with the bracket. So it puts a little too much emphasis on the D going to C. And I would like to point out that they've also violated the law of recovery from G. Oh, no, they haven't. Oh, yeah. They have the best thing to do would be to step down into the G and then go up to the C and then down again. So they're doing the thing where they're walking up and then continuing and taking a step in the same direction. So they outline seventh and step leap in same direction. Letter D. So, what do you think might be wrong with it? They have a little asterisk marked over the F sharp. So what might be wrong there? Let's check the law of recovery. They're leaping from a B up to an F sharp, and they're countering it by a movement in the opposite direction. They even step down from C into B, and then up a fifth, and then down again. So all that stuff is right. The issue here is that the climax is on the leading tone, the F sharp. They're saying it puts too much emphasis there because this really wants to go to there just because of it's the leading tone. And, you know, that's just a very minor recommendation. I think it sounds pretty cool. If you harmonized it right, it would be fine. But for writing Cantus Firmus, don't climax on the leading tone. Don't have your upper, the highest pitch, be the leading tone. So what's the issue? They have a little asterisk there, just showing that there they've repeated a note. So we're going to see in first species, when you're writing your counterpoint line, you can do a note repetition if you really need to. But when you're writing the Cantus Firmus always comes first. So there's really no reason to do a repetition. We're not writing melodies like... what I was trying to play is, here come old flat top, he come grooving up slowly. Like a John Lennon melody, just repeats one note over and over pretty much. Definitely super cool song. But we're not writing a melody like that. We don't need to practice doing that. We're practicing, you know, this special technique. And so don't do immediate repeats of notes. This one is pretty, well, this one's, I was going to say it's kind of subtle. It is kind of subtle. So, as you can see, the C's are brought out, and there's just too much of that C. Everything else is pretty much fine about it. It's just too much C. I'm going to go ahead and sing this because, by the way, I don't want you to be playing these on the keyboard and then singing them after you hear them. I definitely want you to create them in your head. So let's just practice doing that. Giving us a D. So, ready, and D, E, G, F, E, D, E, G, A, G, F, E, D. Gonna remind you this middle line is middle C. This D is right above middle C, so at the base of the treble clef. This G is the line that's circled in the treble clef, that G. The line down here, the lowest line, is F, and that's the F that's circled in the bass clef. Okay, so they have labeled these. That thing is repeated. So in, like, you know, classical melody, you might think, like, yeah, sure, it's a motive, you can repeat things, it's perfectly fine. But in Cantus Firmus, not advised. Non-advisable. Next one is a C, F, E, D, G, F, E, A, F, D, G, E, F, E, D, C. Again, if this is your pop melody or a classical music melody or anything like that, I'm sure it would be fine. But in Cantus Firmus, you don't want these patterns. You're trying to avoid patterns. So you don't want the same idea repeated up a step. You don't want to sequence a motif. And then the same thing, you just have a different motif, but it's almost the same. That thing. So avoid those kinds of repetition. Avoid repeated patterns, even if it's transposed or sequenced. And then finally, if we are in the key of D, so D minor, I just played D natural minor. At the cadence, if we want to raise C sharp D at the end, and if we plan to have a B right before the C sharp, we cannot have the B that's in the key signature, the B flat, because that gives you the augmented second. So you have to raise the B flat to B natural. And that is exactly what you have in the case of melodic minor. So when you're not going to need to worry about this in the Cantus Firmus, but when you're doing your first species stuff, your counterpoint lines, avoid the augmented second between scale degree flat 6 and raised 7. Yes, and you don't have to worry about this in Cantus Firmus, but you do only at the cadence in first species exercises. So let's take a little intermission. I know you're wanting me to change the sound on the synthesizer, so I'm going to do that. Okay, let's move on, shall we? First species, counterpoint, the basic rules. All harmonic intervals, which might call verticalities, need to be consonant. Vertical consonances allowed are unisons, thirds, fifth, sixth octaves, and they're compounds. So compound third is a 10th, compound fifth is a 12th, compound sixth is a 13th. Compound unison, I suppose, would be an octave. You can just think 1, 3, 5, 6. This is going to come up importantly in your R2C exercises. You may have already done that at this point. But if I give you the note C, and I say, give me the 1, 3, 5, and 6 above C, and let's just say it's just white notes above C. So you six. Take any note. I'm just going to this one. I don't even know what it is. I'm not looking. I'm just doing white notes. I can just build 1, 3, 5, 6. That's important because what it means is, given this note, the notes that are going to be consonant with it in first species of the F, so it's an F that I'm using white notes. F, that will make a little bit more sense when you do R2C, and maybe it already makes sense to you. The dissonances, these are things you're not going to use. I told you I was not going to talk about dissonances, but maybe that was before the intermission. Seconds, fourths, sevenths, and then they're compounds. So as compound second is a 9th, compound fourth is an 11th, compound 7th would be a 14th. And then also you're not going to use any augmented or diminished intervals. You're also going to avoid parallel perfect intervals in immediate succession. Avoid parallel fifths, parallel unisons, parallel octaves, as you know. At the beginning and the ending of your exercise, the beginning, as you know, the Cantus Firmus is always going to begin scale degree 1. So if your Cantus Firmus is below and you're writing a counterpoint above, you're always going to begin the counterpoint on either scale degree 1 or scale degree 5. So I'm going to put us back in C. If my Cantus Firmus is down here on 1, then at the beginning I'm going to make it either on 5 or on 1 in the upper voice, because I want to establish tonic. The book is going to tell you that you could also do it on 3, and that's fine. But for standard species counterpoint teaching, it's just 1 or 5. And by the way, 1 and 8 are the same thing. So call this the upper one 1 again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, same thing. If the Cantus Firmus is above, then you're going to begin always on scale degree 1. Maybe it's on the unison, maybe it's on the octave. Maybe it's even the double octave, but that range is a little bit too big. Okay, and at the end, the Cantus Firmus we know is always going to go scale degree 2-1, Rado for in major. So the counterpoint should always go 7-1. And it's going to sound like this. If the Cantus Firmus is above, then the counterpoint is still going to go 7-1 below it. So it would sound like this. And they might converge there. They converged on a octave, but they could converge on unison. Like that. In minor, we'll do it in A. Remember that in minor, you're going to do natural minor the whole time except at the very end. And then you get to raise the leading tone just at the end, second to last measure. So you're still going to have 2-1 in the Cantus Firmus. And it's going to be accompanied by like that. Or it could be. Or. Right. And then if scale degree 6 is coming right before scale degree 7, you don't want to do this. Scale degree 6, raise 7, and then 1. So you raise scale degree 6, raise scale degree 7, and then 1. So if your counterpoint goes 4, 2, 1, sorry, if your Cantus Firmus does that, then you might have. That's a normal scale degree 6. I'm going to raise it. It's hard to hear out of context. That will ultimately make more sense, maybe by the end of this presentation. Otherwise, maybe next week or so. Okay, in minor, just a reminder, raise scale degree 7 only in the penultimate bar, the second to last bar, and raise scale degree 6 only if it immediately precedes 7. Otherwise, you're doing everything in natural minor. The beginning and the middle of the exercises should always be in natural minor. You're going to observe the law of recovery, LOR, as it is sometimes written on your papers, for leaps of a fourth or greater. You're going to avoid leaping more than a fifth in first species. You're going to use parallel motion only up to 3 times in a row, and that would be only for thirds or sixths. We'll see examples of that. Early counterpoint, the organum that we talked about before, was definitely featuring fifths, octaves, unisons, fourths even, perfect fourths. Now, at the point that we're at, in the 14th century and beyond, the most preferred intervals are the imperfect consonances, which are thirds and sixths. So when you're doing your writing, you're still allowed to intersperse imperfect and perfect consonances, but don't do too many perfect consonances. Try to do a lot of imperfect consonances. Weakly, you want to avoid 2 perfect consonances in a row. I mean, even if they're not parallel. So you obviously can't do parallel fifths. But you also don't really want to go parallel or fifth to octave, even if the voices are going in contrary motion. It just starts to sound a little bit empty. You want to throw your imperfect consonances always sound nice in between those. You also want to avoid anti-parallel fifths and octaves. You'll see this on the next screen. That I really don't pay attention to this when I'm grading, and I doubt very many other people do. But you'll see it at some point. Use unisons only at the beginning and or the end of exercises. Don't do them right in the middle. We'll see an example of that. Avoid leaping simultaneously in both voices, especially in similar motion. Avoid voice overlap and voice crossing, which you will see. Voice overlap, for a little definition, is that the top voice is going to go below where the bottom voice was on the previous note. Or, vice versa, the bottom note goes above where the top voice was on the previous note. Very difficult to understand in words, not super difficult in notation, so you will see that coming up. Voice crossing is when the top voice is below the bottom voice in the same exact moment. So it's like, let's say, I've got this note and this note. And I actually said, aha, I fooled you because this one up here is the bass, whereas this one up down here is the soprano, right? If the bass is above the soprano, that's some pretty serious voice crossing. The spacing between the voices in first species should ideally not exceed a tenth. And then we do see an example of in here of it being a 12th. So, if you need to do a 12th, you do that as a maximum. But try to keep the voices within the range of just a little bit over an octave, which is a 10th. And finally, weakly avoid tied notes in the contrapuntal voice. You can use them if you really need them, but try to solve the problem of the setting the melody without using ties, without repeating a note if possible. Intervals in first species, let's pay attention specifically to these ideas of melodic intervals versus harmonic intervals. They're kind of similar and they're kind of not. In composing a Cantus Firmus, a melody, we previously only needed to consider the horizontal intervals when we were doing that. Now, when we're actually getting into first species counterpoint, the essence of counterpoint is to simultaneously consider both horizontal and vertical intervals simultaneously. The aim is to write a contrapuntal line that has its own melodic interest, but that also supports the harmonic implications of the pre-existing melody it accompanies. So there are some similarities, but also some differences in which intervals are considered acceptable between successive notes of a melody, compared with those acceptable between two simultaneously sounding notes, by which I just mean melodic intervals versus harmonic intervals. So a melodic interval, same thing as a horizontal interval or successive interval. So, let's say I've got this melody again. This interval, that's an octave. But in that particular case, it's a melodic octave or a horizontal octave, or it's a successive. Like it's one voice that's doing that. And then here, right, that's a melodic interval. It's going down a minor second. It's going down a major third, major second, up a major second. So let's say in that little melodic excerpt, there was actually had an octave, definitely had seconds. I had a third. I didn't have any fourths or fifths, but I mean, I could. So when you're writing your Cantus Firmi, if we went back to this example, something like that, we have a fifth, seconds, third, and then seconds again. So you're not going to have any unisons because you're not repeating any notes. You might do that in the counterpoint line. So conceivably, you would have unisons. So the smaller intervals you're going to find in melodic stuff. And just to spell it out, you're going to have perfect unison. If you can, maybe. You might have minor seconds. You might have major seconds. You might have minor thirds. You might have major thirds. You might have perfect fourths. You might have a perfect fifth. You're not going to have a tritone. You're not going to have, so that would be either an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth. And you're not going to have that augmented second. That thing. So you're avoiding the augmented second and the diminished fifth. Okay, harmonically, these things are vertical, so we're talking about intervals between the voices that happen simultaneously. You're going to have unisons at the beginning or the end of the exercise. You're going to have thirds. Oops. Third. You're going to have fifths. You're going to have sixths. And then you might have you might have like an octave, right? A compound unison. You might have a tenth. You might have, that one was a 13th. But just like I said, you can think 1, 3, 5, 6. You're going to have unison, third, fifth, sixth as your possible harmonic intervals. Okay. And then thirds, it could be major or minor. Sixths, it could be major or minor. So that gives you perfect unison, major, minor, third, perfect fifth, major or minor, sixth. You're going to avoid all seconds, all fourths, all sevenths, and the diminished fifth. So I know that you guys are wondering, hey, what happened to the perfect fourth? It seemed so perfect last presentation, and now all of a sudden people don't like it anymore. Well, don't you worry your little hearts, because I'm going to tell you all about the fourth. I think you're going to understand what happened. So when the intervals were given their earliest value assignments, the fourth was considered perfect. Perfect intervals were all considered consonant, perfect unison, perfect octave, perfect fifth, perfect fourth. By the way, this goes all the way back to Pythagoras in 2,500 years ago, about 500 BC. So these are the intervals that are derived by dividing the string into one part, which is the unison, 2 parts gives you the octave, 3 parts gives you the fifth, and 4 parts gives you the perfect fourth. Or you could take the first 4 partials of the fundamental, but I just want to point out that they figured that out later. The first 4 numbers for the Pythagoreans had mystical importance, and I remind you of that with this little figure here, which is called the tetractus. This is the number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you add them together, they become 10. So and 10 was also a special number for them. And there's also other kinds of fancy things about this, but they definitely thought that the first 4 numbers were magical in a way, and fifth number was not. So it's partly why the perfect unison, octave, fourth, fifth were considered perfect, and the other intervals were not. In early organum, as you remember, or early counterpoint, from around 850 to 1200, perfect fourths were still considered to be consonances by music theorists, but if you remember, they started being treated less so by the composers. We would see that composers would use fifths and octaves and unisons to end and begin phrases much more commonly than they would use fourths. Simultaneously, composers began using thirds much more, and eventually sixths, while theorists at the time still considered the thirds and sixths to be dissonant in accordance with Pythagorean mysticism. As thirds and sixths get used more frequently, and eventually treated as if they were consonances, theorists come up with a name for them. They call them the imperfect consonances. So thirds and sixths are the imperfect consonances. It bears keeping in mind that if you invert a third, it becomes a sixth. So if I go from C up to E, that's a third. If I just go from E up to that C, it's a sixth. So sixths and thirds are pretty much the same thing. Meanwhile, the perfect fourth is still, to this day, referred to as perfect, but at least in some contexts, it's treated as if it were dissonance. So let's look at an example of this. An upper note is considered dissonant when it forms a perfect fourth above the bass. So in the example, that fourth is considered dissonant, and even it's really hard to hear that as dissonant, but if I put the fourth in the bass, I'm going to keep the same notes, but I'm going to put an A down in the bass. You can hear it in that context. It feels like it wants to resolve. There's something about a fourth wanting to resolve downward to a third. The upper note wants to resolve down. That makes the fourth start to feel unstable. At least that's the theory. And then if the fourth is, so all those cases where it's only if the fourth is measured against the bass. If the fourth is just in the upper voices, it's perfectly fine. It's considered consonant. So that's consonant. 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 I'll put a D in the low bass. Consonant. It's going to become dissonant if I put an A in the bass. That fourth is now a dissonance that has to be resolved. Okay, so the fourth becomes a little bit unstable. The fourth is now considered a dissonance when it's measured against the bass. And the bass, by the way, just means the lowest voice sounding at the time. I mean, if the sopranos were actually singing a lower pitch than the basses, like a physically lower pitch, then the sopranos would be the basses in that particular chord. So it's the lowest pitch sounding. This is the only interval that behaves this way. The fourth, sevenths, seconds, augmented fourths, diminished fifths, they're all considered dissonant no matter what voices they occur in. Slight exception is that some dissonant intervals are considered more dissonant when the bass voice is involved in the dissonance, and this is for the cool psychoacoustic reason. Psychoacoustically speaking, this is because the lower the pitches, the more gritty is the sensory disturbance caused by competing frequency components. I'll just shift this down a bit and show you what a fourth sounds like in a low register. fourth down there is probably more dissonant than the fourth up there. And if I did a minor second, you'll hear it for real. And I'll do it in a higher octave. Actually, it sounds pretty dissonant in both. Mix and match. Let's test ourselves. So we're focusing on types of motion here. First one. Oh, sorry. Which type of motion would that be? Would it be oblique, contrary, similar, or parallel? Well, the top voice goes G-A, so that's going up. The lower voice goes C-F. They're both going up, and it's a fifth going to a third. So it's not parallel. It must be similar. Let's check it. Yeah, that one ready for you? Yeah, similar. Okay, let's try it. The next one. Top voice is going up. Bottom voice is going up. So it's either similar or parallel. These are all thirds. So what do you think? Exactly, parallel. This guy. Top voice is going down. Bottom voice is going up. So it's contrary motion. I gave it away. And the last one, presumably that one's going to be oblique. Otherwise, I don't know. We're running out of words here. One voice staying the same. The other one, yep, that should be oblique. Hey, where are you going? Oh, okay. Good. Got it. So let's specifically focus on this parallel motion. Is it okay to do 3 parallel thirds in a row? We know we're not allowed to do parallel fifths or parallel octaves or parallel unisons. Parallel thirds up to 3 in a row, perfectly acceptable. Don't do more than 3 though. So here's a test. Which things are acceptable? Is it okay to do 5 sixths in a row? Now that actually sounds quite pretty, but is not okay in species counterpoint. It's not contrapuntal enough. The voices are too similar. So you don't want to do more than 3 imperfect intervals in a row. So parallel 6 are fine, but just only up to 3. This one? Parallel unisons, you're not allowed to do any parallel unisons. So it's definitely a no-no. Okay, never okay. And then parallel octaves? No, not okay. Little interlude on interval ambiguity. I'll go ahead and play what's at the top of the screen. So what you're going to see here is that this is a fifth, and this is pretty unambiguous. It implies either a C chord, either major or minor. And the CE is more ambiguous. It implies either C major or A minor. So let's see up close. Some intervals are more ambiguous than others. The ambiguity has to do specifically with harmony, by which I mean chords. This is slightly anachronistic in that chords had not really been invented yet in the Renaissance. Specifically, counterpoint is basically modeled on the practices of Renaissance composers, which I may not have told you all that much in this, particularly Palestrina. So it makes sense for us to be thinking about specifically the Renaissance when we're talking about this. I know that I'm going back and forth between what happens in 1300s, right, the 14th century, and then Renaissance is more 15th, 16th. But the 14th century is just the beginning of this stuff. What we're talking about is all 14th, 15th, 16th century. So Renaissance and whatever came just before it, Ars Nova period. Composers were at least kind of thinking in terms of chords at this point when they're composing like Palestrina, so it's at least permissible. With respect to demarcating specific chords, fifths are much less ambiguous than thirds. If one is in C major, and the notes given are C and G, so that's our C, and then we have those notes C and G. The only triad possible is going to be C, E, G. Say we're still in C major, but we're given the notes C and E. Then we could have a C major chord, or we could have an A minor chord. Right? So a third is more ambiguous than a fifth. note C and E. It could be the root of the C chord, root and third of a C chord, or it could be the third and fifth of an A chord. When the key is not already established, the ambiguity increases in both cases, but more so for thirds than for fifths. So what do I mean by that? Let me just play out of context. I'm going to play an F sharp and an A, F sharp and an A. Okay, so I could say, what chord am I implying? And your answer could be like, well, I mean, if we don't know what key we're in, it could be a lot of different things. That could be the third and fifth of a D major chord. It could be the root and third of an F sharp minor chord. It could be the fifth and seventh, if we're doing seventh chords, fifth and seventh of a B7 chord, or a B minor seventh chord. I don't know, there's lots of other things it could be. Alternatively, if I said F sharp and C sharp, there's not that many things it could be. It could be an F sharp major chord, F sharp minor. It could be the third and seventh of a D major seventh chord, or the third and seventh of a D sharp minor seventh. But that's it. So basically, thirds are always a bit more ambiguous than fifths. And I could ask you then, what do you think about sixths? Well, sixths are going to be just like thirds, and fifths and fourths are going to be similar. So, and then octaves and unisons, like according to that logic, octaves and unisons would be even more ambiguous. But in practice, they're really perceived as, once you start doubling a note at the octave or the unison, that note starts to sound pretty important. So it starts to sound like the root of a chord. So this doesn't really apply to just octaves and unisons. That's why we're seeing composers end phrases and begin phrases with octaves and unisons, because it seems to establish what the tonic is. And sixths are simply the inversions of thirds, so logically they're just as ambiguous as thirds. However, as we'll see, the presence of a sixth implies that a chord is inverted. So if I did this from E up to C, that's in a sense just as ambiguous as C to E, but even more so. And you don't have to understand this yet, but because it's implying a C major chord in first inversion, and a first inversion chord is pretty weak anyway, doesn't always function just like a chord, so there's a lot of instability and ambiguity about what the chord is in any event. So you could say a sixth is even more ambiguous than a third. Now let's look at some examples of first species and do a little critiquing. So I think maybe I'll move a little bit more quickly through these examples. Why can't you do that? Because it sounds like this. Actually, it's exactly the same on the keyboard. And so what is the problem? It's called voice overlap. The alto in measure 3 goes up from the D to G, and it goes up above where the soprano was on the previous note, on the previous bar. Also, you can't do what's on the right side. Or, so I'm just talking about, it sounds fine on the organ. Just talking about for species counterpoint, you want to keep the voices distinct from one another, so you don't do voice overlap. What about this one? The idea there is don't do a unison in the middle of an exercise, because it really sounds like you've just done a little cadence. That's why they put a little fermata and a question mark to say, it's like, oh, did you end there? How about this one? You're not allowed to do that. It's a fifth going to a 12th. A 12th is just a compound fifth, so you might say that's parallel fifths, but it's not, because the voices are moving in contrary motion. That's why they're called anti-parallel fifths, or sometimes called contrary fifths. Like I said, I don't ever grade people against that, but I wanted to at least point it out to you. Also, what you have in letter B. It just sounds like fancy octaves. So again, contrary octaves or anti-parallel octaves. Just try to avoid that if possible, but really mostly don't worry about it. Let's see what we have in example 1-39. Okay. Also not terribly effective. You start on a unison, then you go to an octave, and then you go to another unison. Right? Again, those are just contrary contrary, anti-parallel octaves or contrary octaves. Okay, how about this example? Those are great. Both cases you have contrary motion. So let me play them again because this is subtle. They're saying that you want to weakly avoid these multiple perfect intervals in a row. So this finds contrary motion from an octave to a fifth, to a third. Both of those I think are fine. Okay, because of the contrary motion. Yeah. So let's check out what's in 1-41. It sounds fine, but here they fix it. Check out, see if you like this any better. So the idea there is instead of going 8, 5, 8, 10, 8 and 5 and 8 are all perfect intervals. They're not breaking any rules, but it's not great. Then they go 8, 6, 6, 10. So there's only one perfect interval. So something to keep in mind. These things do sound different with voices. I just don't have a good voice patch on my keyboard. I apologize. So just a reminder of what we want at the beginning of the exercise in the opening measure. Be sure to establish the tonic. If the Cantus Firmus is below, then you're going to begin on either the unison, the fifth, or the octave above the Cantus Firmus. If the Cantus Firmus is above, then when you're writing your counterpoint below it, you're going to begin on either the unison or the octave below the Cantus Firmus. So, for example, Cantus Firmus here goes low C, E, F, and so you could begin on the octave. Here's an example where you might begin on the fifth. It's a different Cantus Firmus. I had to sort of cobble these together, but the Cantus Firmus is the lower voice, D, F, E. So you could begin on the fifth. There you do have a case where the counterpoint voice is tied over. And here's a case where you could begin on the unison. This doesn't happen, I was going to say it doesn't happen very much when the Cantus Firmus is below. And that's just because Cantus Firmi usually start low and then go upward. Anyway, you have problems writing. You have problems avoiding voice overlap. That happens. But in this case, it looks like the Cantus Firmus is in the upper voice. So is the Cantus Firmus. And that's what you've got. Okay. Then when you end the exercise, remember we want re, do is always going to be in the Cantus Firmus. In this case, we're in the key of C. So I'm going to change the octave. Re, do. And in the upper voice, since the Cantus Firmus is always going to do 2, 1, re, do, you want a ti, do in the counterpoint voice. And similar, if the Cantus Firmus is above, it's still going to always go re, do in the Cantus Firmus. It's just above now. And your lower voice is going to go ti, do. So there they're converging on unison, or it might be an octave. So just to summarize, your Cantus Firmus is always ending re, do, 2, 1. If you're in major, and therefore your counterpoint voice should always go ti, do, 7, 1. If you're in minor, it wouldn't be re, do, it would be ti, la. And in minor, it won't be ti, do, that's 7, 1, it'll be si, la. We will see an example of that. So let's start with this example, Cantus Firmus. We're going to pretend that we're composing it ourselves. So we're going to sing the Cantus Firmus. I'm going to give us a C. C, ready, and C, D, E, F, G, E, F, D, C. But the alto clef, always sing the note names rather than solfege. And then now look away from the music and see if you can do it from memory. I do it and I sing it once and then I sing it a second time and I keep going faster and faster until I have it memorized. C, D, E, F, G, E, F, D, C. And then I can look away. C, D, E, F, G, E, F, D, C. Okay. So you want to internalize it, at least for the moment, while you're composing the other voice. So you do that, you sing it, and then you memorize it. Then you're going to plan out the beginning and the end of the exercise. So we're going to start on a unison, or an octave, or a fifth. So if the chant goes, then begin on a unison. We can't begin on a unison actually because it's going up in bar 2, so there's no way we can. Yeah. Anyway, if we're supposed to write a counterpoint above it, then we have to either begin on the fifth or the octave. Okay, so here the begin on the octave. We're always going to end T do, remember, because the Cantus Firmus is always going to end Re do. So now we can look at our upper voice, and we know it's going to start up here, and then it's going to do some stuff in the middle, and then it's going to end T do. And I'm just reminding us that we got this from Marchetto of Padua earlier. That thing. Or if it's inverted the other way. Okay. So the third thing that we are going to do is identify the climax in the Cantus Firmus. So that G is the highest note. So let's put a little circle on the G. And then we want a climax in our counterpoint. It's just somewhere other than, it might be like the measure before, the measure after. In this particular case, it's weird, but the climax happens like in the very second measure. But we want a climax somewhere else. So we just sketch it in often and then check to see if it works. Then we're just going to fill in the remaining blanks. And, you know, like this is all already filled in, but we would fill in these other notes and try it out. And then we just check for any problems. And if they arise, we deal with them. So as you work, indicate the generic intervals between the staves. Let me just go ahead and play this. As you work, indicate the generic intervals between the staves. So octave, 10th. Notice we're ending 6th to an octave. That's common. So notice that I placed a little box around the 8ths. And if there were any 5ths, here we would place boxes around the 5ths. So place a box around the 5th and the 8th. And then double check to see that there are not 2 5ths in a row. 2 perfect 5ths, right? Or 2 octaves in a row. For all the 5ths, then also just make to check to be sure that they are perfect. If one of them is diminished between the T and Fa, right? Scale degrees 7 and 4, you have to change it. Change one of the notes. Okay, and then sing your upper line while playing the Cantus Firmus on the piano, and then vice versa. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so do, and I'll play the Cantus Firmus. Do, since I'm a male voice, I'm really singing this what's here an octave below. So maybe I even want to I'll do it one more time, a little faster, where I'm just playing the Cantus Firmus below, because I will want it to sound below. Otherwise, some of these things won't. They won't be the right interval. The 6th will actually be a third. The octave will be a unison, etc. So, do, fa, mi, re, ti, do, la, ti, do. I got lost in there. Okay, and then we'll do the opposite way. So I will sing do. I'll sing C, D, E. Okay, while playing the counterpoint. C, D, E, F, G, E, So now we're going to do a similar thing. It's just now that the Cantus Firmus is above and we're, imagining that we're composing a line below it. It's the same exact Cantus Firmus. Okay, so we sing this Cantus Firmus. We've already done it. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, mi, fa, re, do. Or C, D, E, F, G, E, F, D, C, because it's alto clef. For alto clef, always sing the names. Now look away from the music. We just did that. Plan out the beginning and ending of the exercise. So it starts on C, so we just want to make sure that we're starting on a unison or an octave and not the fifth below, because we want to establish C as tonic. So there, check here, this is middle C, right? Middle of the alto clef, and this is also middle C above the bass clef. So this is exactly the same note. The Cantus Firmus is always going to end re, do, D, C. So we're going to counter it with T, do. So they're converging on a unison, just like what we have here. Identify the climax in the Cantus Firmus. It's this G. Then sketch in the potential climax in the counterpoint. So here, this is where the authors decided to put the climax. It's not a very climactic pitch. It's just one note above the tonic, but all the other notes are lower than it, so it is technically the climax. And note that it's off. It's not in the same exact measure. It's just one note, one measure before. So then we just fill in the remaining blanks, and that's what we have here. We have a B and a C, we have a G, a C, and A, and those are the only remaining blanks, right? So once you fill in beginning, end, climax, you don't have all that much work remaining to do. As you work, indicate the generic intervals between the staves. And place a box around each 5 and 8, which we have done. There's no 5s, but we have a unison and octave and a unison. I'll play what it sounds like. For all the fifths, check that they're perfect. Check that they're perfect. If one's diminished, you got to change it. And then sing the lower line while playing the Cantus Firmus on the piano. Do, I can do a high do. Do, T, do, re, sol, do, la, ti, do. Ooh, that's hard. And C, D, E, F, G, C, E, F, D, C. Okay. Now we're going to really do this piece by piece. Again, this is just like directly from the book. Sing the Cantus Firmus for the alto clef. So G, why don't you sing with me? G, D, C, A, B flat, C, B flat, A, G. I'm gonna close my eyes. I kind of think of it as round up to the fifth, da dum dum, down to the second, ya da 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 da, and then reverse chorus, like that. So try to memorize it, plan it out. Da 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 da. Plan out the beginning and the end. So at the beginning, we want to start on a unison or an octave. So this G here is at the top of the bass clef staff. That G is there, so we're starting an octave below. And so the Cantus Firmus here is ending T La, because we're in minor. So still scale degree 2, 1, and then we have scale degree raise 7, 1 in the bass for C, La. identify the climax in the Cantus Firmus, which is here, second note. And then we're sketching in this climax here on the E flat. Fill in the remaining blanks and address any problems as they rise. So you can see there's only one blank there, since we sketched in a climax, and then we got 4 blanks in there. So here's what the authors of the textbook do, and let's go ahead and play that. So as you work, indicate the generic intervals between the staves. Octave, 12th, 10th, 6th, octave, 6th, 10th, 8th. Oh, I should have put my 12th in a square, but I didn't. I forgot. 12th is just like a compound 5th. And remember I said like try to keep the distance between the voices to a 10th, but this is the one instance where they do it as a 12th, so it's kind of wide. I did say place a box around each octave and 5th, just like before. For all the 5ths, check that they're perfect. This 12th, let's check to see if it's perfect from G up to D. G natural, D natural. That is a perfect 5th or perfect 12th. So yes, it's fine. It's not diminished. Then we're going to sing the lower voice while playing the Cantus Firmus on the piano. Okay, ready to do it with me? I don't know if I can sing that low. I'm going to try. I'll do it there. Ooh, that's hard. And vice versa, I'll play the counterpoint while sing the Cantus Firmus. Do, la, G, G, D, C, A, B flat, C, B flat, A, G. Okay, so this seems mostly fine. It doesn't break any rules, but the authors are going to point out that this D, they changing this note to a D. I can't remember exactly what their justification is, but that makes this a 6th. But then they have this problem where they have what they would say is like kind of like a motive. So their counterpoint line goes. It's just too patterny. So in order to get rid of the pattern, they're just going to change a little bit in the beginning. So what do they end up doing? They change this note from a G to a B flat. So this becomes not a 12th, but a 10th. And I think they change one more note. Yeah, I don't remember what this was originally, but now it is a C. So they have an octave. So let's hear that. So I wrote that wrong. That is a 5th right in here, not a 6th. Okay, the rest looks right. So let me just do it again from the beginning. Okay, and then you'd sing one line and play the other. So in conclusion, will you be able to do this by yourself? I hope so. Species counterpoint is to music composition as crossword puzzles are to poetry. When you compose music, you don't have to follow these rules of species counterpoint. However, when doing species counterpoint exercises, you should follow these rules. And you should sort of like enjoy learning these weird rules as if it's a crossword puzzle or Sudoku. Doing so will not make you less creative. Just in the same way that doing crossword puzzles is not going to make you a worse poet. Don't make the mistake, however, of so similarly, don't make the mistake of evaluating other people's musical compositions according to the rules of counterpoint. Just as you wouldn't try to correct the grammar in the poetry of E.E. Cummings, you wouldn't want to go around and capitalize the E's and the C's in the E.E. Cummings or something like that to make it more perfect. Don't try to do that in creative work, pop song you hear on the radio. Don't critique it for not following these rules. These rules are sort of like exercise. Okay. Make sure to use your counterpoint practice to make you a better musician. I have that musician part in italics. Don't make the mistake of treating these exercises like a silent puzzle. The technique is simple enough that you should do it slowly and deliberately, with the primary goal of practicing hearing each line in your head and the combination of the lines together. And I end with a little bit of poetry from E.E. Cummings, since feeling is first. Who pays any attention to the syntax of things will never wholly kiss you. Okay, good night, everybody.